I hope you've had a chance to read that chapter on reproductive technologies, but whether you have or haven't, let me at least begin by making sure you know what the in vitro procedure is. You may not be familiar with it. In vitro fertilization primarily intends to address female infertility. If, for example, a woman's fallopian tubes are blocked and so she can't get pregnant, in vitro is a way to harvest eggs, fertilize them in a petri dish, and then transfer them into her uterus and hope that they attach to the uterine wall and develop into a baby. Having said that it is predominantly a reproductive technology that addresses female infertility, it would only be fair to say that it also can be used to address male infertility. For example, if a woman's reproductive system is working fine, but let's say a man has a very low sperm count, so he cannot succeed in impregnating his wife. This is one way you can harvest the eggs, fertilize them in a petri dish, and then transfer it to the womb. And so this would be a way. It's not the only reproductive technology that would address male infertility. Artificial insemination also will address male infertility. But IVF is predominantly intended to help women who can't conceive. Well, what is the process? And here, this is not intended to be pornography or anything of the sort. It is a chart, however, that gives you an idea of what happens. Basically, the process begins with the woman undergoing a series of injections of hormones that are meant to stimulate the production of eggs in her ovaries. And at a certain point then in her cycle, it's a good time to be able to harvest the eggs. And so what is done is there's a surgical procedure. It's not, something where she has to be under general anesthetic or anything like that, but they use a laparoscope, which is a long needle and tube, actually a long tube that allows you, it has a little camera on it, to see inside where the ovaries are, and then you can insert a needle into the ovaries, harvest a bunch of eggs, remove them, put them into a petri dish, and then you take the husband's sperm that has been provided, and you put it into the petri dish, fertilize all the eggs that are there, and you wait until they develop to 6, 8-celled embryos, etc., and then the doctor has to decide which are the embryos that are going to be most likely to attach to the uterine wall. And of course, the mother has had to get more hormonal shots to make sure that her womb is prepared to receive the embryos. And then the embryos can be inserted into her womb. You don't have to do it through a needle. That would probably kill the embryo. So it's some sort of tube that will allow the developing embryos to be there, but to get it into her uterus in a way that you would if her husband were able normally, through normal sex relations, to impregnate a wife. And then you wait uh, and hope and pray that at least one of those embryos attaches to the uterine wall, because if it does, then after that point there's no more manipulating of the reproductive process, and the pregnancy then develops like a normal pregnancy would, and hopefully there's no miscarriage along the way. 9 months later, the baby is born. So that's the basic procedure. Uh, you can tell it is somewhat complicated. What you also should know is that it is not cheap. For one of these cycles to occur is going to probably cost, well, depending on the facility, somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $15,000. And you have to pay that whether you're successful or whether you're not in getting pregnant. If you go through this cycle, invariably they're going to take more eggs than you would ever want to transfer into a womb at one time. But all the eggs are going to be fertilized, and those that aren't used, in some cases they're just discarded. In many cases, they are frozen so that if things don't work the first time and you want to try again, you don't have to do the whole process over. You have some eggs that are already there. Or if it does work and you have a baby and later on you decide you want another baby, but you don't want to start the process all over again, well, you've got some eggs being stored. But class, the majority of eggs that are fertilized and frozen never get used. As you read through the discussion of in vitro in the chapter, you'll see what the estimates were. Several years ago, the time I was writing this, I saw an estimate that roughly at that time, or a few years before that, there were something like, I don't know, 400,000 frozen embryos, or maybe more, or that's the amount that's being added. It's just an enormous amount that's being added. And hence you understand with the debate over stem cell technology, why some people have argued that, well, we're not in favor of harvesting more eggs and fertilizing them. Wouldn't it at least be okay to do embryonic stem cell research on the frozen embryos? Because everybody knows that most of those are never going to get used, so they're going to die anyway. So at least put them to some positive use. By the way, that's consequentialism, bald-faced. And it's also sort of outrageous, well, not sort of, it is outrageous if you think that once you have a fertilized egg, you have a human person. And if you're wondering about that, we talked a little bit about personhood, but I'm hoping you're reading the chapter on abortion, and you'll get all the biological, et cetera, evidence to defend that this is a person from conception onward. Then if this is a person, and that's what we've argued, then what that means is even if those frozen embryos are never going to be thawed and used for attempts to have a baby, even so, what we're saying is there are all of these human beings. I mean, these frozen embryos are human beings, and what you're saying is because they're not going to be used for pregnancies, it's okay to go ahead and use them for stem cell research. No. Stem cell research, what it does to the embryo, destroys the embryo. It takes a part of it, and it destroys the embryo. And so what this basically means is if you're in favor of using those eggs, you are saying because stem cell technology could help other people, it's okay to take these people who are on ice, destroy them to help others. Well, that's not moral. That, to use Immanuel Kant's terminology, human beings are to be seen as ends in themselves, not as means to ends. What that is doing with embryonic stem cells using embryos on ice is using persons as means to ends rather than ends in themselves, and that's not moral. Especially, put it this way, if you're a non-consequentialist, it's not moral. If you're a consequentialist, of course it's moral. Some people who are consequentialists would say it's your moral duty. Well, okay, you can already tell what the major ethical issue is going to be with this. We're not to take innocent life. And you might say, yeah, I believe that. But IVF doesn't take innocent life. It's a way to have a baby. And what we hear most of the time, and all that we hear most of the time, is the large numbers of babies that are being born. Yeah, that's what you hear, but it's not all the facts. And I want to touch on at least a few of the facts so that you'll see that when someone like myself says this is a procedure that still is too wasteful of embryonic life to be morally acceptable, you'll understand why I would say that. Now, you'll get all of these statistics in the chapter on reproductive technologies and in the section on in vitro. But let me just give you a few of the highlights, not as many as I was planning, but a few of them, so you get a feel for this. We have data from 1996 through 2005, and they show an increase in the number of IVF babies born in the United States. And the way these things get talked about is, first of all, they talk about how many ARTs occur in a year. You say, what's an ART? That's an assisted reproductive technology cycle. So they calculate how many cycles of assisted reproductive technology occur. Well, what's involved in an ART? It has several steps that occur over 2 weeks. And the set of treatments, the whole set of treatments is considered a cycle. Well, okay, what about that? The cycle begins when a woman starts taking drugs to stimulate egg production, or begins to monitor ovarian action with the intent of ultimately transferring embryos to her womb in hopes of having a pregnancy and ultimately a baby. So an ART begins with the shots and the monitoring and goes all the way through the process of extracting the eggs, fertilizing them, transferring them to the womb, and then seeing what the result is. Okay. So that means an ART involves the taking of eggs from the ovaries. And obviously, they want to take more than just one and take a whole bunch. And they're going to fertilize all of them. They're not just going to fertilize one of them. And if you believe that a fertilized egg is a human person, as we've argued, then that means you've got a whole bunch of human beings created. If you fertilized all those eggs inside of a woman, you'd have human beings. Why does the fact that you fertilize it in a petri dish make them non-human? They're either human as fertilized eggs or they're not. And the place where you fertilize them makes no difference to that whatsoever. It does make a difference to whether they'll survive or not, but it doesn't matter as to whether you have a human being or not. Well, so what are some of the statistics then? Well, let me let me be selective here. What I'm wanting to say then is that when you hear how many reproductive cycles there are, don't think that in one reproductive cycle only one egg is taken and fertilized and only one egg is transferred. Well, why would they do more? Well, for the simple reason that when this process began to be used, which was in the early 70s, and then they started to have clinics in the 70s and 80s and whatnot, the success rate of producing a baby was roughly, somewhere in the neighborhood, I think, of 15 to 20%. But they thought as this becomes more common, the success rate will go much, much higher. And the truth of the matter is that the success rates even today have not increased dramatically over what they were when this originally began. I'll let you read the details on that in the book. So then, what is the success rate? Well, there's not a simple answer to that, not because we can't say anything, but because there are some things we have to say. Whether you're going to be successful depends on a number of different things. It depends, in the first place, on how many eggs are transferred to the embryo, transferred to the uterus on a given occasion. Success rates, if you only transfer one embryo to the womb, are very low. Looking to see what we have here. For example, in 1996, 6% of the cycles, which would be the whole thing, used only one embryo. 10% of the cycles used two. 23% of the cycles used three embryos. And 62% used four or more. Now, just because you use more than one doesn't mean all of them are going to result in a baby. In fact, the hope is, and the intention is, that they don't. Otherwise, if you transfer 3 or 4 embryos and all of them attached to the uterine wall, you've got instant family, right? So what's the point of transferring more than one embryo if you don't want more than one? Well, because the success rates are much higher if you transfer more than one. Well, what do you mean the success rate? Not the success rate that all of them transferred will be successful and you'll get a baby from each one, but instead, the likelihood that you'll get one that attaches and you'll get one baby increases with the more embryos you use. So you can see the majority of people in 1996 were using 4 embryos at a time. In 2005, the statistics were a little bit different. 9% used only one egg. 43% of the transfers were of using 2 eggs. 30% of the transfers used 3 eggs, and 18% used 4 eggs or more. Now, when you compare this, that means that the major change since 1996 is that instead of using 4 or more embryos for most cycles, in 2005, most cycles used only 2 embryos. But even so, in 2005, 91% of the cycles used more than 1 embryo. Well, what are the success rates of this? Well, I can tell you both in 1996, what the rates were and what they were in 2005. In 1996, when one embryo was used, the success rate was 6.2% that you would get a baby. For paying $10,000 to $15,000 and going through all the shots and the way, yeah. When 2 embryos were used, the success rate was 14.4%. But don't misunderstand me. It wasn't 14.4% of the time you got 2 babies. It was 14.4% you got 1 baby, though you used 2. With 3 embryos, your chances were 29.3% of the time you would get 1 baby. What about the other 2? Well, they were lost. With 4 or more, the success rate of getting 1 baby out of that was 31.6%. That's in 1996. What about in 2005? In 2005, with 1 embryo, the success rate was 16.7%. That means it was about 10% better than it was about 10 years previous, but still not a whole lot. With 2 embryos, the success rate in 2005 is that you'd get 1 baby 40.9% of the time, which means that 59.1% of the time you got nothing. With 3 embryos in 2005, your likelihood of getting 1 baby, 34.3% of the time. So, guess what? Now you see why in 2005 it was more likely that you get a baby if you use 2 embryos than if you use 3 or 4. In fact, in 2005, with 4 or more, your success rate of getting 1 baby went down to 27.6%. Now, one of the things that also happens is sometimes you use multiple embryos, and much to the dismay of the doctor and perhaps the family, all of them attach. And why is that to the dismay? Well, not just that you didn't want instant family, but it's to the dismay because when you have multiple embryos, you're more likely to have problems with all of them. Premature birth is much more likely. Some sort of other problem with the embryo. And obviously, it's much harder for a woman to carry twins or triplets than it is to carry a single baby, not to mention what labor and delivery are like. So you know what happens a lot of times? If it turns out that you're using 3 embryos and they all attach, a lot of times the doctors will say, it would be to your advantage and to the kid's advantages if you would abort one of those. And women say, okay, I only wanted 1 baby anyway. So if I've got 3 and you take 1, I'm still going to have more than I was trying to get. Another factor, and I won't give you the statistics on this, you can read them, but another thing that affects success rate is how old the woman is. The older you get when you do this, the less likely you are to succeed in getting anything. I'll let you read the statistics there in the book. Well, okay, that's alarming if you think every one of those fertilized eggs is a human being. But just how many eggs and embryos are actually lost? And let me give you some statistics, and this is going to boggle your mind, I promise you. In the year 2000, and this information is not gleaned from evangelical doing research. This comes from the Centers for Disease Control, U.S. Centers for Disease Control. In 2000, in the United States, there were 99,629 ART cycles. And that doesn't mean there were only that many embryos, because an ART can include 2 or 3 or 4, or initially it can include 10 or 15 that's extracted from the mother's ovaries and all fertilized in the Petri dish, and obviously they're not going to use all of them. Nobody's going to endanger the woman's life by transferring 15 or 20 embryos, let alone they're not going to all stay. Okay, well now also according to statistics, only 30.7% of all of those cycles resulted in a pregnancy. So what that means, class, is that only 30,586.1 of the 99,629 cycles resulted in a pregnancy. And don't miss what was just said. I didn't say resulted in a live birth. I said resulted in a pregnancy. Because everyone knows that you can be pregnant and have a miscarriage. Okay. Well, that means then that 42.9 of the 99,629 cycles resulted in nothing. Beginning to see how many people are lost? Well, and now remember this, that normally nowadays in a cycle with embryo transfer that gets to that point, at least 2 embryos are transferred. So what that means is the 69,042.9 cycles that resulted in no pregnancy, each one of those cycles involved at least 2 embryos. So multiply the 69,000 times 2, and you begin to get an idea of how many babies, human beings, were lost. Well, but there's even more to the story. As we noted, 30,500 and some of the total cycles resulted in a pregnancy, but how many of those pregnancies resulted in a live birth? Well, 83% of those pregnancies resulted in a live birth. But that means that the number of live births from pregnancies in 2000 was 25,386.46. Wow, that's a lot less than 99,000 times 2, which is the total number, if you're conservative, the total number of human embryos that were produced. And I say if you're conservative because I'm saying only 2 per cycle. We know that there's more than that. So do you begin to see what is happening? And over the last 10 to 15 years, it's become sort of standard that the amount of embryos you transfer in this process, which isn't the amount of eggs you extracted and fertilized, but the amount of the fertilized egg that you transfer to the womb is slightly more than 2 embryos per attempt, that's been the most successful. Well, okay, then let's just look at those cycles alone, where 2 embryos were used. Let's not think about all the other embryos that were created and whatever were done with them, frozen or just thrown away. Let's then say 2 embryos per transfer. And we know the statistics that there were 99,629 cycles, so it would be 2 times 99,000 plus cycles. That means a total of 199,258 embryos were transferred in 2000. That's at least those, because we're being conservative. There were other cycles that used 3 or 4 embryos. And of that 199,250 some, the total number of babies that was born, 35,025. But you know what that means? That means that 164,233 embryos that were transferred resulted in nothing. So class, do you see what these statistics mean? Just from a practical standpoint. If you're thinking about doing this, be realistic. I mean, I hope you don't do it. But if you're even really seriously thinking about it, what this means is the likelihood, the chances that you're going to wind up with a baby are much smaller than that you're going to wind up with nothing. I mean, look, 199,000 embryos producing 35,000 infants. That's not even 50% of the embryos, a 50% chance you're going to get something. And at $10,000 to $15,000 for this procedure a pop, even if you're independently wealthy, that's not a wise investment of your time. I mean, even apart from the morality of it, that's not a wise investment of your wealth. You see, those are the statistics you don't see in the newspaper. You've got to go online, et cetera, and look for certain types of statistics and read the literature, and you find out what's actually happening. Well, you may say, I guess it's not as bad, though, as it could be, because a lot of embryos are frozen, and they can be used in another try. Well, you know what? Back in about 75 or 1980, when these clinics started, the success rates were pretty low, but they thought, before too long, they're going to be dramatically higher, and they haven't changed that much. And you know what? You'll see the information in the text. What scientists know is that freezing the embryo isn't as good as it sounds, because over time, embryos on ice deteriorate, and so they're less likely to produce a successful pregnancy than if they're used at the beginning. You'll see the statistics that in another way show this. You can imagine there are people who have recorded every possible variable. They'll tell you the success rates if you use fresh sperm and egg, or if you use frozen sperm and egg. They'll tell you the statistics if you use sperm from the husband and and egg from the wife, and if you use sperm from the husband, from someone else and from the wife, or if you use the wife's egg or a donor egg. They've got the statistics on all of these. And whether the sperm and the egg are fresh or frozen, they've got the statistics on that. And you'll see that when it's frozen, regardless of who it comes from, it's less likely to succeed in a pregnancy, in resulting in a pregnancy and a birth than not. So, if you believe that a fertilized egg is a human being, then my main moral objection to this procedure as it is currently done is that it's too wasteful of human life. My other major ethical objection is that it is an experiment on a human being without that human being's consent. Now, you may think this guy is loony. What does he mean? If something's experimental, it means that it hasn't been done. Well, this has been done for many, many years. Look, class, I'm not saying that getting eggs, putting them in a petri dish, and fertilizing them with sperm is an experiment and we don't know whether it's going to work. No, we do know that. That's not my point. I know that that's not the experiment, but with the success rate of having the embryo implant in the uterus and produce a baby being as low as they are, my point is you do have a human being once you have a fertilized egg, and you are performing an experiment. What's the experiment? We're going to see if we can succeed in transferring these embryos to the baby, to the mother's womb, and see if we can wind up with the baby. Well, you've been successful a lot of times. Yeah, but there have been far more failures than successes, so it's still an experiment. You don't know with any single embryo whether it's going to work or not. That sounds to me like an experiment. And it's an experiment on a human being, and it's an experiment without that embryo's consent. So if you're really inclined to be moved by upholding people's freedom, and I think we should be moved by that to some extent, that means that not only are you breaking the rule not to take innocent life, but you're also breaking the moral rule not to abridge people's freedom. So, did you hear me say anything like, well, this is immoral because it's unnatural or playing God or what? No, didn't say that. In fact, you'll see at the beginning of the discussion of genetic engineering that we look at all of those and see whether they are good arguments, and basically they're not. That's not my objection. It's the stuff I'm talking about. And the evidence that I'm not just imagining this are the statistics. That out of 199,000 human beings, there's only 35,000 live births. Wow. That means that about 1/6 of the fertilized embryos wind up getting born. 5/6 of them don't. I don't think we're talking about, 49% of the lives are lost and 51% are preserved, or the other way around. No, we're talking about maybe 10% to 15% of these lives get to live and the rest of them die. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this is too wasteful of human life to be a moral procedure. Well, someone might say, and believe me, I am coming to an end because I've got to talk with you about the test. I realize where we are in the hour. Someone might say, well, would you be okay with this if we only took one egg, or if we only fertilized one egg and we only transferred one egg at one time? Well, I think that would be less wasteful of embryonic life, but it's still an experiment because you'll read the statistics. With one embryo, the chances of producing a baby are very, very small. So, and oftentimes when they only use one embryo, they still fertilize all of the eggs because the doctor has to look after they have grown a little bit in the Petri dish to say, well, which are the candidates that are most likely to be successful? And what do you do if you fertilize one egg and the doctor observes it over a few days and it doesn't look like it's going to be successful? Well, then why even put the woman through the embryo transfer stuff? No, you're not going to try this without fertilizing multiple eggs, even if you only use one. Well, what if at some point in the future, technology advances to a point where they've developed some way to gestate an embryo outside of the mother? They come up with some artificial placenta. I have read things about that in the literature, though I haven't seen anything for a long time about it. So that you don't have to take the risk of the mother going through all of this and losing the baby. I mean, the success rates with only one embryo, you still have to fertilize a number of them to know which one is likely to be the best. But the success rates of producing a baby with that would probably go up to 99% or more. Would that be morally acceptable? Well, I think we would have to review the process, and it might be at that point that we could say, okay, I think this is morally permissible. I can't imagine, well, I know it could never be morally obligatory to use IVF, because that would mean that people who can have children through normal sex relations would be forbidden. And that doesn't make any sense. But I think it could be morally permissible. But class, we're nowhere near that. There isn't any outside of the womb medium where you can gestate kids for 9 months, successfully or unsuccessfully yet. If at some time in your lifetime that comes, and you can see that the success rates go way up, then I think we have to take a look at the procedure again and say, well, maybe in some instances. But right now, I don't see it as morally acceptable to use this. And I know that it's horrendously impractical, because I can't think that there's any one of us in this room who has a spare $10,000 to $15,000 to throw down the drain. Because really, in most cases, that's what's going to happen. And even if you do have that kind of money, that's not a good use of your money. And read through the chapter and read other literature. See what the process, what the procedure, the whole process is. Guys, are you sure you want to put your wife through that, when the likelihood you'll get a baby is so small?
Well, Professor, do you get a refund if it's unsuccessful?
Nope. Nope. And I don't think as of yet, though I haven't checked on this lately, I don't think that reproductive technologies are covered by health insurance. So yes, you are going to pay the whole cost to the clinic. And on top of that, if you're using a clinic in another state, you're going to have to pay to get yourself there. And since the woman has to take a series of shots and they have to monitor when it's the best time to take the embryos from the ovaries, that means, and they encourage her during a lot of this to be sure you're off your feet. So you're going to have to rent a hotel room, and you're just going to have to lay there, the wife is, for long periods of the day until it's time to go over and maybe they try this. So that means you're going to have hotel bills and restaurant bills and travel bills in addition to all of this, and maybe you're going to wind up with nothing. Not just maybe, probably you're going to wind up with nothing most of the time. Why am I telling you this? Well, in part, yes, because I'm concerned about the morality of this, and I don't want any of us to do something that's immoral, but because I am sure that already there are people who are here, who are taking this course and listening to me, who have people in your church who want babies, can't have babies, and are seriously considering this, and all they know are the statistics that you see in the newspaper about how many children are born each year from IVF, and so they think, wow, this is a sure thing. I can have a baby. Yeah, it's going to cost me something, but how can you put a price on the life of a child? Yeah, they need to know all the statistics. Because part of what's going to happen, class, you know this, when they wind, Christians who go through this process are going to tell you, we've prayed and thought about this and talked about it, and we're convinced that this is God's will, and then they try it and it doesn't work, and their faith may be shattered, and you've got to pick that up. So, again, is this information you should know? Yeah. Is it information you should pass on? Yes. Yes. And not just in one-on-one counseling. I think you need to make sure that the congregation knows this. You say, well, there's some of them people who are in their 50s or 60s. They're never going to have kids. Yeah, but they have children who are at a point in life where it's time to have children and they can't. And the parents want grandchildren and they can't. And so they can think, oh, well, why don't you try IVF? And of course, class, you know that the wife is not the only possible person who could carry the baby. With this kind of technology, you could also hire a surrogate mother whose physical condition and her reproductive system might be more likely to succeed in carrying that baby to term than yours, especially if you've had a bunch of miscarriages. Your wife has. So it's not just think about IVF and the morality of it in and of itself. Realize that with IVF, this opens the door to all sorts of things. Surrogate mothering, this is a way that lesbian couples who will not have sex with a man can have children. And not just lesbians, but homosexual couples. Elton John and his partner have children, and they proudly display this on TV, and the news media goes bonkers and thinks it's wonderful. Yeah, that's the result of this technology. It's wonderful to be able to have a baby and to help people who are infertile. But, you know, a lot of good things also have a downside. Be informed and warn people against the downside. One question or comment, and then I must talk to you about the exam and let you go. Yes, brother.
A single Christian woman who believes in the sanctity of life and has a desire to save life where she can and wants to put the money up to rescue one of these embryos and comes for counsel on the issue of, I want to save a life, I can't save all of them, they're going to try to implant a few embryos in there, and if I can get one, there's one I've saved.
Great question. Let me repeat it. What about a Christian woman who's a single woman who is very pro-life? She's aware of all the frozen embryos, or that in the case of someone who's going into a clinic to have the first stages of this process done, that's going to happen. And so she says, well, I'd like to volunteer to take another one of those embryos so that you don't have to discard the rest of them, or the majority, or freeze them. What about that? Well, I know the intent is to protect life, but with what you've heard in the last half hour about how likely this is to succeed, do you think it's moral for her to try to protect life this way? I don't. Why? Well, if only one embryo is used, the likelihood that she'll be successful in producing a baby is relatively small, and even if they use 2 or 3, it's not very likely that it will either. Now, I also think that, you have to realize you have to get that woman's reproductive system ready so it's prepared for an embryo transfer. I would say, in addition to that, there's the question of, is this God's ideal design for parenthood and family? I would be more sympathetic if it was a married woman who said that. And I guess if the question is, throw the embryos away or put them on ice or find someone who's willing to be a recipient, well, I wish that the embryos had never been produced to begin with, but they're there. Well, okay, you could give it a try and then pray like crazy that it attaches to the womb, but realize that the likelihood is not very good. As I've suggested in the book, this, I think, is parallel to the situation where an unmarried woman has premarital sex and gets pregnant. Now, that never should have happened. But then, what does that mean is morally acceptable to do with the baby? Well, not have an abortion, not kill it once it's born, not abandon it. No. Once you have a human life, there's a duty to protect that life. But that situation, the unwed teenage mother, is not the same as what you're talking about. I would, in the case of an unwed woman, I would be very hesitant to say, yeah, go ahead. I know your motives are altruistic and everything. I'd feel better about it if it was a married woman and there was a good bit of prayer and consideration, and there was an understanding of all the risks, etc. And they said, I know all of that, and I know it's going to cost something, and of course I'm not going to be paid for doing that. I think I should try. I think you could say, okay, that would be morally permissible. Surely you're not going to say, well then, go ahead and tell someone else who's thinking about doing that, go ahead and produce the embryos and then I'll take one. No. It would have to be already existing embryos that are going to be lost. I think that's probably the best I can do in the limited time. But thank you for asking the question. That's a really great question. And it does impinge on a biblical concept of marriage and family life. And please don't misunderstand what I said. I didn't just say it would be never possible to have a child with only one parent. That would mean that if one spouse dies, that's an immoral family for the other parent to try to... No, that's not true. But it's one thing if the child is already born and then one spouse dies. It's another thing if you're not even married and there isn't a child that's been born and then you want to go and do this. Those are different things. Well, class, you have been more than gracious, not just today, but all week long. This has been absolutely fantastic, as I knew it would be. And I thank you so very, very much for your attentiveness, for your involvement in this, and obviously all the other students that have been involved. I want to also express my appreciation to the administration of Masters and especially to Dr. Snyder for doing all the arrangements. This wouldn't have happened without him. Thanks to all of you. Thank you for your incredibly gracious hospitality to me, all of you. I just wanted to start there because I wanted to be sure I got to say that to you because I was fearful once you get the feel for the test, you may pack up and leave, and I won't get a chance to say that to you. So thanks so very much. I trust that this information that we've shared will really make a difference in your lives and the lives of the people that you minister to. Thanks for letting me share these things with you.